Hello everyone, and welcome back to Crimson Shadows, the channel where we delve into the darkest corners of the human psyche. The stories we share are a haunting reminder that sometimes the most monstrous acts are committed not by strangers in the dark, but by those we trust the most, those we share our lives and our homes with. The case we are about to unravel is a chilling testament to that the story of love, betrayal, and a brutality that is almost beyond comprehension. It's a story that will make you question how well you truly know anyone. Before we descend into this harrowing tale, if you are fascinated by true crime and want to explore more cases that reveal the hidden darkness within seemingly ordinary lives, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting that notification bell. Your support helps us continue to bring these important and often forgotten stories to light. Now, prepare yourself as we uncover the grim reality behind the headlines of a husband, a wife, and a septic tank. To the outside world, Mark and Eleanor Rutherford were the epitome of a perfect couple. They lived in a charming, two-story colonial in the quiet, leafy suburb of Maple Creek, a town where everyone knew each other, and gossip, though whispered, traveled fast. Their lawn was always impeccably manicured. Their two golden retrievers, Apollo and Zeus, were a familiar sight on their morning jogs, and their annual 4th of July barbecue was a neighborhood institution. They had been married for 15 years, and to anyone who saw them, they were the very picture of domestic bliss. Mark was a successful architect, a man whose ambition was matched only by his charisma. He had a ready smile, a firm handshake, and a way of making everyone feel like they were the most important person in the room. He was the kind of man other men wanted to be and women were drawn to. He had designed some of the most beautiful homes in the county, and his name was synonymous with quality and innovation. He was a pillar of the community, a member of the local Rotary Club, and a generous donor to the town's charities. He seemed to have it all: a thriving career, a beautiful home, and a loving wife. Eleanor was the perfect complement to Mark's ambition. She was a gentle soul, a talented artist who had given up a promising career to raise their two children, a decision she never once regretted. Her paintings, mostly vibrant landscapes of the surrounding countryside, adorned the walls of their home, a testament to a talent that was now reserved for her own pleasure. She was the heart of the family, the one who remembered birthdays, organized school events, and made sure their home was a warm and welcoming haven. She was a devoted mother to their son, 14-year-old Ethan, and their daughter, 12-year-old Chloe. Her life revolved around her family, and she found her greatest joy in their happiness. Their love story was the stuff of local legend. They had met in college, a whirlwind romance that had culminated in a picturesque wedding in a small, countryside chapel. The early years of their marriage were filled with laughter, adventure, and a deep, abiding love. They had built a life together, brick by brick, a life that was the envy of many. But as with any facade, no matter how carefully constructed, cracks were beginning to appear. To the casual observer, they were invisible hairline fractures that were easily overlooked. But to those who knew them best, there were subtle signs that all was not as it seemed. The laughter that had once filled their home had become less frequent, replaced by a strained silence that hung heavy in the air. The easy affection they had once shared had been replaced by a polite distance, a chasm that was growing wider with each passing day. The first noticeable fissure appeared about a year before the unspeakable happened. Mark had taken on a new project, a large commercial building in the city, an hour's drive from Maple Creek. The project was demanding, and Mark began working longer and longer hours. He would leave before the sun was up and return long after the children were in bed. When he was home, he was distant and preoccupied, his mind clearly elsewhere. He would spend hours on his phone, his voice a low murmur, a guarded tone that was a stark contrast to his usual boisterousness. Eleanor, ever the supportive wife, tried to be understanding. She knew how much this project meant to him, how much he had invested in it, both professionally and personally. She would wait up for him, a hot meal on the stove, but more often than not, he would claim to have eaten at the office. She would try to engage him in conversation, to bridge the growing distance between them, but her efforts were met with monosyllabic answers and a dismissive wave of his hand. The children felt the change too. Ethan, a sensitive boy who idolized his father, found his hero becoming a stranger. He would try to show his father his latest school project or tell him about a victory on the soccer field, only to be met with a distracted nod and a cursory, "That's great, son." Chloe, a bubbly and outgoing girl, began to retreat into herself, her bright smile replaced by a quiet sadness. The truth, as it so often is in these stories, was a woman. Her name was Isabella, a young, ambitious interior designer who had been hired to work on Mark's new project. She was everything Eleanor was not. Where Eleanor was soft and yielding, Isabella was sharp and driven. Where Eleanor was classic and understated, Isabella was modern and bold. She was a whirlwind of energy and ambition, and she had set her sights on Mark from the moment they met. Their affair began as a series of clandestine meetings, stolen moments in dimly lit bars and anonymous hotel rooms. It was a dangerous game, and the thrill of the illicit only fueled their passion. To Mark, Isabella was a breath of fresh air, an intoxicating escape from the suffocating predictability of his suburban life. With her, he felt alive, invigorated, a man reborn. He was no longer just a husband and a father. He was a lover, a man of passion and desire. The affair quickly escalated from a physical dalliance to an emotional entanglement. Isabella was not content to be a secret. She wanted more. She wanted it all. She began to weave a web around Mark, a web of flattery, manipulation, and promises of a future together, a future free from the constraints of his family and his life in Maple Creek. She painted a picture of a life of excitement and adventure, a life where he could be the man he was always meant to be. The cracks in Mark and Eleanor's marriage began to widen into gaping chasms. The arguments became more frequent, more vicious. The strained silences were now punctuated by shouting matches that would leave the children trembling in their beds. Eleanor, heartbroken and desperate, confronted Mark about his affair. She had found a receipt for a hotel room in his coat pocket, a receipt that was a damning piece of evidence of his betrayal. Mark, for his part, did not deny it. He was arrogant, dismissive, almost cruel in his admission. He told Eleanor that he was in love with Isabella, that he wanted a divorce. He told her that he was tired of their life, of the endless monotony of their suburban existence. He told her that he wanted to be free. Eleanor was devastated. The life she had so carefully built, the life that was her entire world, was crumbling around her. She pleaded with him. She begged him to reconsider, to think of the children. She reminded him of their vows, of the promises they had made to each other. But her words fell on deaf ears. Mark was a man possessed, a man blinded by his infatuation with another woman. The next few months were a living hell for Eleanor. She was a ghost in her own home, a silent witness to the slow and painful death of her marriage. Mark made no secret of his affair. He would talk to Isabella on the phone in front of Eleanor, his voice laced with a tenderness that was now reserved exclusively for his mistress. He would come home late, the scent of another woman's perfume clinging to his clothes. He was a man who was already gone, a man who was just waiting for the right moment to walk out the door. But leaving was not as simple as Mark had hoped. Eleanor, though heartbroken, was not a woman to be trifled with. She had given up her career for him. She had dedicated her life to him and their children. She was not about to walk away with nothing. She consulted a lawyer, and it soon became clear that a divorce would be a messy and expensive affair. Half of his business, the house, a significant portion of his income, it was a price Mark was not willing to pay. Isabella, too, was growing impatient. She was not content to be the other woman forever. She wanted to be Mrs. Rutherford, to live in the beautiful house in Maple Creek, to be the one on Mark's arm at social events. She began to pressure him, to give him an ultimatum. It was her or his wife. He had to choose, and in the dark recesses of his mind, a monstrous plan began to take shape. It was a plan born of desperation, of greed, of a chilling lack of empathy. It was a plan that would allow him to have everything he wanted. Isabella, his money, his home, his freedom. It was a plan that would require him to silence Eleanor forever. The septic tank, a mundane and often forgotten part of their idyllic suburban home, became the centerpiece of his macabre design. It was a place of darkness and decay, a place where secrets could be buried, where a life could be erased. It was a solution, a final, terrible solution to the problem that was his wife. The transformation of Mark Rutherford from a respected architect and loving family man to a cold-blooded killer was a gradual one, a slow descent into a moral abyss. It was a journey fueled by a potent cocktail of ego, lust, and a chilling sense of entitlement. He had convinced himself that he was the victim, that Eleanor was the one standing in the way of his happiness. He had dehumanized her in his mind, reduced her to an obstacle that needed to be removed. In the weeks leading up to the murder, Mark became a master of deception. He was a man playing a role, the role of a concerned husband, a man who was trying to salvage his marriage. He suggested they go to counseling, a cynical ploy to create the illusion of a man who was trying to make things right. He would bring Eleanor flowers, a hollow gesture that was a cruel mockery of the love they had once shared. He was a wolf in sheep's clothing, a predator stalking his prey. Eleanor, desperate for any sign of hope, clung to these empty gestures. She wanted to believe that the man she had loved for so many years was still in there somewhere, buried beneath the anger and the resentment. She wanted to believe that their family could be saved, that they could find their way back to the happiness they had once known. It was this hope, this desperate, clinging hope, that would ultimately seal her fate. The night of the murder was a stormy one, a fitting backdrop for the horror that was about to unfold. The wind howled, and the rain beat against the windows, a symphony of nature's fury that mirrored the tempest in Mark's soul. He had sent the children to his parents' house for the weekend, a carefully orchestrated move to ensure that there would be no witnesses. He had planned every detail with a chilling precision. The tools he would need, the time of day, the alibi he would create. He had researched how to dispose of a body, how to clean a crime scene, how to erase every trace of his horrific act. He was a man on a mission, a man driven by a singular, terrible purpose. As Eleanor slept, unaware of the awake that was about to consume her, Mark stood over her, his heart a cold, hard knot in his chest. In that moment, he was no longer a husband, no longer a father. He was a monster, a creature of the night, a man who was about to commit an act of unimaginable evil. The life they had built together, the memories they had shared, the love that had once bound them, it all meant nothing to him now. All that mattered was Isabella and the new life that awaited him. And as he raised his hand, the storm outside raged on, a fitting requiem for the life he was about to extinguish. The facade had not just cracked. It had shattered into a million irreparable pieces, revealing the darkness that had been lurking beneath the surface all along. The storm that raged outside the Rutherford home was a mere whisper compared to the maelstrom of thoughts and intentions swirling within Mark. Every creak of the old house, every rustle of the leaves against the window pane, seemed to amplify the pounding in his chest. He stood in the dimly lit hallway, a specter in his own home, the tools of his monstrous trade clutched in a white-knuckled grip. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind 1,000 times, playing out every scenario, every possible contingency. But the stark reality of what he was about to do was a cold, suffocating weight. He moved with a practiced silence, a predator stalking his prey in the dead of night. The floorboards, usually so prone to groaning under his weight, seemed to hold their breath as he passed. He paused at the door to the master bedroom, the place where he and Eleanor had shared their dreams, their fears, their most intimate moments. It was a room that had once been a sanctuary, a testament to their love. Now it was to become a tomb. He pushed the door open, the faint moonlight casting long, distorted shadows across the room. Eleanor was asleep, her face a mask of tranquility in the pale light. A stray curl of her auburn hair had fallen across her cheek, and for a fleeting moment, a flicker of something, was it doubt? Was it remorse? Crossed Mark's face. He saw her not as the obstacle to his happiness, but as the woman he had once loved, the mother of his children. He remembered their first date, the nervous excitement, the easy laughter. He remembered the day Ethan was born, the overwhelming sense of love and responsibility he had felt as he held his son for the first time. But the memories were a fleeting wisp of smoke, quickly extinguished by the all-consuming fire of his desire for Isabella. He saw Isabella's face, her vibrant smile, her intoxicating eyes. He heard her voice, a seductive whisper in his ear, promising him a world of passion and excitement. The choice had been made, the die had been cast. There was no turning back. He moved to the side of the bed, his shadow falling over Eleanor's sleeping form. His heart was a jackhammer in his chest, his breath a ragged gasp in the stillness of the room. He raised the heavy wrench he had brought from the garage, the cold steel a stark contrast to the warmth of his hand. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, a moment of indecision that felt like an eternity. And then, with a guttural cry that was more animal than human, he brought the wrench down with all his force. The sound was a sickening thud, a sound that would forever be seared into his memory. Eleanor's body convulsed, a final, desperate struggle for a life that was being brutally extinguished. He struck her again, and again, and again, a frenzy of violence that was as senseless as it was savage. The room, once a haven of peace and love, was now a scene of unimaginable horror. When it was over, he stood panting, his body trembling, his mind a chaotic whirlwind of adrenaline and disbelief. He had done it. He had actually done it. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. The silence that followed was more deafening than the storm outside. It was a silence filled with the weight of his sin, a silence that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The hours that followed were a blur of frenetic activity, a desperate attempt to erase the evidence of his monstrous act. He was an architect of death now, his meticulous planning and attention to detail focused on a new, gruesome project. He wrapped Eleanor's body in a heavy-duty tarp he had purchased weeks before, a cold, impersonal shroud for the woman he had once vowed to love and protect. He dragged her body through the house, a dead weight that was a constant reminder of the life he had just taken. He left a trail of blood, a crimson ribbon that marked the path of his descent into darkness. He was a man possessed, driven by a primal need to conceal his crime, to bury his secret deep in the earth. The septic tank, the centerpiece of his macabre plan, was located at the far end of the backyard, hidden behind a thicket of overgrown bushes. It was a place that was out of sight, out of mind, a perfect hiding place for his terrible secret. He pried open the heavy concrete lid, the stench of raw sewage rising to meet him, a foul, nauseating odor that was a fitting metaphor for the ugliness of his soul. He worked with a grim determination, his face a mask of cold, hard resolve. He had to dismember her body, a gruesome task that would have made a lesser man falter. But Mark was no longer the man he once was. He was a man who had shed his humanity, a man who was capable of a level of brutality that was almost beyond comprehension. He used a saw he had taken from his workshop, the high-pitched whine of the blade a chilling soundtrack to his horrific work. He worked through the night, the storm providing a convenient cover for his gruesome activities. The rain washed away the blood. The wind carried away the sounds of his macabre labor. By the time the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds, the deed was done. Eleanor Rutherford was gone, her body submerged in the foul depths of the septic tank, her existence erased from the face of the earth. He spent the rest of the day in a frantic cleanup, a desperate attempt to restore the illusion of normalcy. He scrubbed the floors, he repainted the walls, he burned the blood-soaked tarp and his clothes in a bonfire in the backyard. He was a man possessed, a man who was trying to outrun his own conscience. When the children returned home that evening, he was the picture of a grieving husband. He told them that their mother had left, that she had packed a bag and walked out on them. He put on a convincing performance, his voice choked with emotion, his eyes filled with crocodile tears. The children, devastated and confused, clung to him, their innocence a stark contrast to the darkness that now consumed their father. In the days that followed, Mark played the part of the abandoned husband to perfection. He filed a missing person report, his voice filled with a feigned concern that was sickeningly convincing. He spoke to the police, he spoke to Eleanor's friends and family, he spoke to the local media. He was a man who was putting on the performance of a lifetime, a performance that was designed to deceive the world. He told them a story of a troubled marriage, of a wife who was unhappy, who was looking for a way out. He painted a picture of a woman who had simply walked away from her life, from her family, from her responsibilities. He was a master manipulator, a man who was able to twist the truth to fit his own narrative. Isabella, for her part, was a willing accomplice in his deception. She was the one who had urged him on, the one who had whispered poisonous words of encouragement in his ear. She was the one who had painted a picture of a future that was free from the inconvenient presence of his wife. She was a woman who was as cold and calculating as he was, a woman who was willing to do whatever it took to get what she wanted. They continued their affair in secret, their clandestine meetings now filled with a new, dark intimacy. They were bound together by a terrible secret, a secret that was buried in the backyard of the Rutherford home. They were partners in crime, their passion fueled by the thrill of their shared transgression. But the weight of his secret began to take its toll on Mark. The nights were the worst. He would lie awake, the image of Eleanor's lifeless face burned into his mind. He would hear her voice, a ghostly whisper in the silence of the night. He would see her in the faces of his children, a constant reminder of the life he had so brutally extinguished. He began to drink heavily, a desperate attempt to numb the guilt, to silence the voices in his head. He became paranoid, jumpy, a man who was constantly looking over his shoulder. The charming, confident architect was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed shell of a man who was being eaten alive by his own conscience. The police, at first, had no reason to suspect him. He was a grieving husband, a pillar of the community, a man who was doing his best to hold his family together in the face of a terrible tragedy. They followed up on his story. They interviewed Eleanor's friends and family. They searched for any sign of her. But the trail went cold. Eleanor Rutherford had simply vanished without a trace. But there were those who were not so easily fooled. Eleanor's sister, Sarah, had never liked Mark. She had always seen through his charming facade, had always sensed a darkness lurking beneath the surface. She did not believe for a second that her sister would have just walked away from her children, from her life. She began to ask questions, to push for answers, to be a thorn in the side of the police investigation. She pointed out the inconsistencies in Mark's story, the things that just didn't add up. Why had Eleanor left without her car, without her wallet, without her phone? Why had she not contacted her children, not even once, in the weeks since she had disappeared? Sarah's suspicions, at first dismissed as the ramblings of a grieving sister, began to gain traction. The police, though they had no concrete evidence, began to look at Mark in a new light. The cracks in Mark's carefully constructed alibi began to appear. A neighbor reported hearing a loud argument on the night of the storm. A store clerk remembered selling Mark a large, heavy-duty tarp and a saw just days before Eleanor's disappearance. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, and they were painting a very different picture of Mark Rutherford than the one he had presented to the world. The descent into darkness was complete. Mark had gone from a respected member of the community to a man who was capable of the most heinous of crimes. He had sacrificed his family, his soul, his very humanity, all for the sake of a fleeting passion. He was a man who was living a lie that was about to come crashing down around him. The septic tank in his backyard held more than just the remains of his wife. It held the truth, a truth that was about to be unearthed, a truth that would expose him for the monster he truly was. The crisp autumn air of Maple Creek carried a chill that had little to do with the changing seasons. A palpable sense of unease had settled over the once tranquil suburb, a disquiet that whispered through the rustling leaves and clung to the manicured lawns. Eleanor Rutherford had been missing for 3 months, and the initial flurry of concern had morphed into a gnawing suspicion. The face of her husband, Mark, once a symbol of community strength and success, was now viewed with a mixture of pity and a burgeoning, unspoken distrust. Eleanor's sister, Sarah, was the relentless catalyst for this shift in perception. Fueled by a sister's intuition and an unshakable conviction that Mark was hiding a terrible secret, she became a one-woman army, a constant presence at the police station, a persistent voice in the ear of lead detective Frank Miller. Miller, a seasoned investigator with a weary but sharp gaze, had initially been inclined to believe Mark's narrative of a distraught wife who had simply fled a crumbling marriage. But Sarah's persistence, coupled with the subtle yet mounting inconsistencies in Mark's story, began to erode his initial assessment. The turning point came from an unexpected source. Ethan, Mark and Eleanor's 14-year-old son, had become increasingly withdrawn and sullen since his mother's disappearance. He had been a quiet boy to begin with, but now a heavy silence seemed to permanently shroud him. One evening, during a routine follow-up interview with Detective Miller, a seemingly innocuous question about the night his mother vanished prompted an unexpected reaction. Miller asked about the bonfire Mark had in the backyard the day after the storm. Mark had explained it away as simply burning some yard debris. But Ethan's face paled. He remembered that fire. He remembered the acrid, chemical smell that had clung to the air, a smell that was nothing like burning leaves or branches. He remembered seeing his father, his face grim and streaked with soot, feeding a large, dark, plastic-like material into the flames. At the time, he had been too consumed with the grief of his mother's departure to give it much thought. But now, in the sterile environment of the police interview room, the memory took on a sinister new meaning. He hesitantly recounted the details to Detective Miller, his young voice trembling with a dawning horror. Ethan's testimony was the key Miller had been waiting for. It wasn't hard evidence, but it was a significant crack in the foundation of Mark's carefully constructed lie. It provided the impetus for a search warrant. The next morning, a fleet of police cars descended upon the Rutherfords' charming colonial home, the flashing blue and red lights a stark, jarring intrusion into the serene suburban landscape. Mark, who was just leaving for work, was met on his doorstep by Detective Miller and a team of uniformed officers. The color drained from his face, his carefully maintained composure finally beginning to crumble. He protested, his voice a mixture of feigned outrage and genuine panic, but his words were hollow, his authority stripped away. He was a man who had lost control of the narrative, a man whose carefully constructed world was about to be unceremoniously torn apart. The search of the house yielded little. It was, as Mark had intended, meticulously clean. But the backyard was another story. The forensic team, armed with specialized equipment and a grim determination, began a systematic search of the property. The area around the septic tank, a patch of overgrown grass and weeds that Mark had conveniently neglected, drew their attention. A specially trained cadaver dog, brought in as a matter of course in missing person cases, began to bark and whine with a frantic intensity, its focus fixed on the heavy concrete lid of the tank. A sense of dread, thick and suffocating, settled over the investigators. The air grew heavy with unspoken fears, with the grim anticipation of a horrific discovery. A specialized crew was called in to pump the contents of the septic tank, a nauseating, macabre task that was performed with a somber professionalism. And then they found her, or what was left of her. The gruesome, dismembered remains of Eleanor Rutherford, a testament to the unimaginable brutality of her final moments, were brought to the surface. A collective gasp rippled through the assembled officers, their hardened exteriors momentarily pierced by the sheer horror of the discovery. The truth, in its most grotesque and undeniable form, had been unearthed. The news of the discovery spread through Maple Creek like a wildfire, a wave of shock and horror that shattered the town's idyllic facade. The man they had known as a respected architect, a loving father, a pillar of the community, was a monster. The whispers of suspicion that had been circulating for weeks erupted into a chorus of condemnation. Mark Rutherford was arrested on the spot, his face a mask of disbelief, his carefully crafted lies dissolving in the face of the irrefutable evidence. He was led away in handcuffs, a fallen idol, a man who had been exposed for the cold-blooded killer he truly was. The image of the charming, successful family man was replaced by the mugshot of a murderer, his eyes vacant, his soul laid bare for the world to see. Isabella, the catalyst for Mark's descent into darkness, was also brought in for questioning. She was a picture of cool, calculated detachment, her initial denials a well-rehearsed performance. But as the weight of the evidence against Mark became clear, as the reality of a lifetime in prison as an accessory to murder began to sink in, her carefully constructed facade began to crack. She turned on him, her self-preservation instinct kicking in. She painted a picture of a man who was obsessed, a man who was controlling, a man who had acted alone. She was a woman who was willing to sacrifice anyone, even the man she claimed to love, to save herself. The trial of Mark Rutherford was a media sensation. The courtroom was packed every day, the public's fascination with the gruesome details of the case, a morbid testament to the dark side of human nature. The prosecution, led by a sharp, no-nonsense district attorney, laid out a damning case against him. They presented the forensic evidence, the testimony of the neighbors who had heard the argument, the store clerk who had sold him the tarp and the saw, the chilling testimony of his own son. Mark's defense team, a high-priced group of lawyers who specialized in damage control, tried to paint a picture of a man who had snapped, a man who had been driven to a moment of temporary insanity by a failing marriage and a shrewish wife. But their efforts were futile. The evidence was overwhelming, the brutality of the crime undeniable. The most powerful testimony came from Eleanor's sister, Sarah. She took the stand, her voice filled with a raw, heart-wrenching grief, and she spoke of the sister she had lost. She spoke of Eleanor's kindness, her generosity, her unwavering love for her children. She painted a picture of a woman who had been a victim not of a momentary lapse in judgment, but of a cold, calculated, and utterly selfish act of evil. Her words hung heavy in the air, a powerful indictment of the man who sat just a few feet away, his face a stony, unreadable mask. In the end, the jury took less than 4 hours to reach a verdict. Guilty. Guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of a crime that had shattered a family, that had stolen a life, that had stained the very fabric of their community. Mark Rutherford, the man who had once had it all, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was a man who would spend the rest of his days in a concrete cell, a prisoner of his own making, haunted by the memory of the woman he had so brutally murdered. Isabella, in exchange for her testimony against Mark, received a lighter sentence. She was convicted of accessory after the fact, a legal term that did little to capture the true extent of her moral culpability. She would serve a few years in prison, a small price to pay for her role in the destruction of a family. The Rutherford children, Ethan and Chloe, were the true victims of this tragedy. They had lost their mother to a brutal act of violence, and their father to a life behind bars. They were left to navigate a world that had been irrevocably broken, to carry the weight of a legacy of darkness. They were placed in the care of their aunt, Sarah, a woman who would do her best to provide them with the love and stability they so desperately needed, but who knew that the scars of their childhood would never truly fade. The charming colonial house in Maple Creek, once a symbol of the perfect suburban life, stood empty, a silent testament to the horror that had unfolded within its walls. The manicured lawn was overgrown, the paint was peeling, the windows were dark and vacant. It was a house that was haunted, not by ghosts, but by the memory of a love that had turned to hate, of a dream that had become a nightmare. It was a stark and chilling reminder that sometimes the most monstrous secrets are buried not in a dark and distant graveyard, but in the most ordinary of places, right in our own backyards. The unearthing of the truth had brought a killer to justice, but it had also revealed a darkness that would forever linger in the heart of a town that had once believed in happy endings.